Let me go ahead and read a little bit about the introduction. And Dr. Stanislov Grof is a psychiatrist with more than 40 years of experience in research of non-ordinary states of consciousness. In the past, he was principal investigator in a psychedelic research program at the Psychiatric Research Institute in Prague in Czechoslovakia. He was chief of psychiatric research at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, assistant professor of psychiatry at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, and scholar in residency at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. Currently, he's professor of psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco and Pacifica Graduate School in Santa Barbara, where he conducts professional training programs in holotropic breath work and transpersonal psychology and gives lectures and seminars worldwide. He is one of the founders and chief theoreticians of transpersonal psychology and the founding president of the International Transpersonal Association. Among his publications are over 100 articles in professional journals in the book Realms of Human Unconscious, The Human Encounter with Death with Joan Halifax, LSD Psychotherapy, Beyond the Brain, The Adventure of Self-Discovery, Beyond Death, The Stormy Search for the Self, the last two with Christina Grof, his wife. The Holotropic Mind. What do we have? Books of the Dead, the Manuals of Dying and Living, The Cosmic Game, and a number of other rich works that he has contributed to the scientific field of non-conscious states. And today, he will talk to us about the psychology of the future, lessons for modern consciousness research. Dr. Grof, thank you.
Good afternoon. Before I start talking, I would like to thank for the invitation. I really appreciate being here, particularly being here at this very important historical moment from my perspective, which is, return to psychedelic research. There is sort of early pilot study, I hope, beginning of many studies that will come. I would like to start in a very unconventional way. And if you find it too personal, just ignore me. I would get away with it in California. I don't know how things are here. And please don't raise your hand until I finish the sentence. I would like to ask you, how many of you had in your own life some powerful experiences of non-ordinary states? I don't mean just psychedelic. This could be something that happens in spiritual practice, part of meditation, participation in some native ritual, some powerful form of experiential psychotherapy, powerful experience in hypnosis, near-death experience, or experiences that just happen. You don't ask for it, you might not like it, you don't do anything for it, and it happens anyway. So any of those categories, can I ask you? Okay. Quite a few people. That helps, because my main focus will be on non-ordinary states of consciousness. Usually when I talk for academic audiences, I start with a few biographical anecdotes, because many of my colleagues have difficulties understanding how somebody with all the right credentials, background in medicine, in psychology, can take something like spirituality or mysticism seriously, can believe that we need something like transpersonal psychology, is giving workshops and writing books with funny, somewhat flaky titles like Beyond the Brain or The Cosmic Game or The Stormy Search for the Self. So I would like to just share something from my history so that you understand how something like this can happen. First of all, I never thought I would be a psychiatrist. I would study medicine. I was much more interested in art. I wanted to be in animated movies. And actually, when I was finishing what would be high school here, we call it gymnasium in Europe, I already had my interview and I was supposed to start in the film studios in Prague. And just at that time, a friend of mine gave me a book, Introductory Lectures to Psychoanalysis by Freud. And I started reading it in the evening. I got so excited I couldn't go to sleep. I read through the night. And within about 2 days, I decided I would let the animated movies go and I would go study medicine to become a psychoanalyst. I'm sort of mentioning it before because what I will be talking about will take us very far beyond Freudian analysis. I want to sort of somehow describe my initial commitment to Freudian analysis. So I joined a group of analysts who were operating in Prague, and very shortly after then had to go underground because of the communist putsch. I had 7 years of Freudian training, which was a private arrangement between me and my analyst, because it would have been dangerous for either of us if somebody knew what we were doing. I also had absolutely no exposure to religion, and this goes back to major drama in our family. My parents met in a small Czech town. They fell in love. They wanted to get married, but there was a problem because my father's family had no religious affiliation. My mother's family was strictly Catholic, and the local church in this small Czech town refused to marry them because my father was a pagan by their definition. And so there was a major problem. It seemed like the marriage would not happen at all until my grandparents found a brilliant solution, which was, of course, a major financial donation to the church. And then they relaxed their standards, decided to marry a pagan. My grandparents' dream came true, which is they had a house on Main Street. They could roll carpets from the house across the street, stop traffic, and sort of continue up the stairs to the altar. So the guests could go from the altar right into the house. And my parents got so upset they decided they wouldn't commit me or my brother to any religion, and we should sort of make up our own mind when we come of age. And then from this kind of background, which means I was not participating in any of the classes in religion that my peers were. And then from this background, I would go to medical school. As you know, certainly doesn't cultivate mystical awareness particularly. And in addition, I studied medicine in Prague at the time when we had a Marxist regime. So we would get really the pure materialist doctrine. So I studied medicine, I became a psychiatrist, and very soon I got into deep conflict about psychoanalysis, which was the reason why I studied psychiatry. And this was the conflict between the theory and practice of psychoanalysis. I was increasingly excited about the theory, into how many areas psychoanalysts have penetrated and given seemingly brilliant interpretations for all kinds of things. Symbolism of dreams, symptomatology of neurosis, psychopathology of everyday life, religion, content of art, socio-political movements, and so on. So that was very exciting, but then I also became aware of what you can do with psychoanalysis as a practical clinical tool, and that was a whole other story. It was a very narrow indication range. You had to meet very special criteria. And then particularly there was the enormous amount of time, energy, money. My own analysis was over 7 years, 3 times a week, with tremendous commitment. And I had difficulties understanding that. I had a very Freudian, orthodox Freudian analyst who used to say psychoanalysis is the science of the human mind. There's nothing psychoanalysis cannot explain in that department. There are only things that it hasn't explained yet because there were not the right subjects for the free associations on the couch. And you had to study medicine to become an analyst. And in medicine, if you really understand the problem, you usually can do something fairly dramatic about it. Or if it's an incurable disease, you have a pretty good understanding why you cannot. But here the idea was that we have complete understanding and yet we can do so little over such a long period of time. So I became very disappointed. I started kind of nostalgically thinking back about the animated movies. I should have never chosen this discipline. And then something very powerful happened in my life. This was the time when there was excitement about psychopharmacology, the early tranquilizers, antidepressants. And we just finished a large study of malarial, which came from Sandoz pharmaceutical company. So we had a good working relationship. And as you know, if you have a good relationship with pharmaceutical companies, you get a lot of fringe benefits. So they send you free literature. They might pay your trip to a conference when you report about their preparation. And they also send you a lot of other preparations, that they develop. So as part of this cooperation, we got a big box of ampules, and there was an insert that came with it. It said this was LSD-25, very interesting investigational substance discovered in the laboratories of Sandoz practically by accident by Dr. Hoffman. It was supposed to be a drug for relief of migraine headache and stopping gynecological bleeding, and sort of fell a little far from the tree. Dr. Hoffman intoxicated himself accidentally when he synthesized this sample. He found out it had a very powerful psychoactive effect. They reported this, gave it to Dr. Stoll, who was the son of Dr. Hoffman's boss, the psychiatrist in Zurich. And Dr. Stoll, in 1947, published the first scientific paper on LSD in a group of so-called normal volunteers and psychiatric patients. This became a sensation overnight, and Sandoz now was sending samples to different research institutes, to universities, and also to individual therapists. And they were basically asking, would you work with the substance and let us know if there was any legitimate use for LSD. And in the letter, they suggested two possibilities. One was we have a feeling on the basis of the pilot study that this drug produces in minuscule dosages of millions of a gram a state that's very similar to naturally occurring psychosis. So it's possible that psychiatrists, psychologists would have a model here. You could give it to normal people, do all kinds of testing before, during, and after, get some insight about what's happening in the body when these changes in the mind are occurring. And it could turn out that schizophrenia and other psychosis would really be chemical problems. They would not be psychiatric problems at all. The excitement about LSD was not the effect, because there was already knowledge of the psychedelic effects of mescaline. Mescaline was studied in the 30s. But the excitement was about the minuscule dosage, because it was conceivable that the human body could produce, under certain circumstances, small quantities of a similar substance and be responsible for psychotic phenomena. And the idea was, if we can identify the substance, we can find some neutralizing agent, and there would be a test tube kind of a solution. Then there was a second point which became something that changed my life, and that was a little note that said, we also feel that maybe this substance could be used as a kind of unconventional training tool for psychiatrists and psychologists and students and nurses. Professionals would have the opportunity to spend a few hours in the world of their patients, and as a result of it, be able to communicate with them better, to understand them better, and hopefully to be more effective in their treatment. So this was an opportunity I wouldn't have missed for anything in the world. I became one of the early volunteers. And my preceptor, who got the substance from Sandoz, at the time was interested in EEG. And he was also interested at the time in what's called driving the brainwaves, exposing people to different acoustic and optical frequencies and studying in the corresponding areas of the brain if entrainment happens, if the brainwaves will pick up the frequency that is being fed. So those of us who wanted the LSD experience had to agree to have not only the EEG done, but also our brainwaves driven, sort of before, during, and after. It looked practically was that between the second and the third hour, when my experience was culminating, a research assistant came and said it was time to drive the brainwaves. So she took me to a little cell. I lay down. She pasted the electrodes on my head, asked me to close my eyes, and then brought this gigantic strobe, put it above my head, and turned this thing on. And in the next moment, there was light like I had never seen in my life, couldn't even imagine existed. My first idea was this must have been like what it looked like in Hiroshima when the bomb went off. Today I think it was more like the Dharmakaya, the primary clear light from the Tibetan Book of the Dead that we're supposed to see at the moment of death. My consciousness was catapulted out of the body. I lost the connection with the body. I lost the research assistant, I lost the clinic, I lost Prague, then I lost the planet, and then I had the feeling my consciousness had absolutely no boundaries. And when she was following very carefully the protocol, going from 2 cycles to 60 back, then leaving it for a while in the middle of the alpha, then the theta, then the delta range, and then she turned it off. And as she was doing it, I had this incredible cosmic type of experience of cosmic consciousness. And then when she turned it off, my consciousness started to shrink again. I found the planet, I found Prague, I found my body. And after a while, I managed to align my consciousness with my body again. And I was very impressed what just had happened to me. And I thought, I'm stuck with psychiatry, so this by far is the most interesting thing you can do when you're a psychiatrist, study non-ordinary states of consciousness. So for the last, it's now 45 years, I have really done very little else professionally, but something that was in one way or another related to these non-ordinary states. About half of the time was clinical research with psychedelics in the Research Institute in Prague, and then at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, where for a few years I was heading the last surviving psychedelic research in the United States. The second half, my wife Christina and I developed the holotropic breathwork, where you can induce powerful non-ordinary states using very simple means like faster breathing, some evocative music, and a certain kind of body work. I had a lot of contact with anthropologists. I spent some time with shamans. I participated in various ceremonies of native cultures, with peyote, with mushrooms, with ayahuasca. I did some work with people who had near-death experiences. We also had one of the studies we did at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center was work with people who had terminal cancer facing death. So we're working with people with near-death experiences, and having contact with thanatologists, doing some work with people who had UFO abduction experiences, some of the people studying these kinds of experiences, in contact with some spiritual teachers, Siddha Yoga, the people of the Benedictine order, some Zen Buddhists, and so on. So all these things also work with people who had spontaneous episodes of what we call spiritual emergencies, but basically psychotic states with a lot of spiritual content. So I published a number of books about it, because during this work there were many challenging experiences and many challenging observations. Quite a few of them could not be somehow interpreted in terms of the kind of training that I got in medicine, in psychiatry, and in psychoanalysis. So I wrote books on the different aspects of these observations. And quite a few of them have been published by State University New York Press. And then about 3 years ago, I got a letter from them that said, we published several of your books, would you consider writing one book in which you would kind of summarize the observations from this work and specify somehow the conceptual challenges, the kinds of observations and experiences that cannot be accounted for in terms of the psychiatry and psychology that we have in the West? And would you also suggest what kind of revisions would have to be made in psychiatry and psychology to accommodate these kinds of experiences? I was just approaching 70 and told myself that I would sort of at least partially retire and pass the training to some other people. So we needed a manual for the training. And so this was a very welcome opportunity to get the manual for our training published by SUNY Press. So I wrote a book and I gave it a kind of deliberately challenging title, Psychology of the Future, expressing my really strong belief that if we systematically study the kind of observations and the experiences in these non-ordinary states, that it would radically change psychology and psychiatry to the extent that it would resemble what happened to physicists in the third decade, that we would somehow catch up with the change in the worldview that happened in quantum relativistic physics and the kind of things that are outlined in what has been called the new paradigm thinking. So this is something that I would like to share with you. And I'm very well aware that it's going to be very provocative for some of you. I have less than an hour to communicate something that took me years to accept when I was experiencing it and I was with people who were experiencing it. So those are really major challenges, conceptual challenges. So I wouldn't expect that it would be easily acceptable. But, the exciting thing is that you're going to have psilocybin research here, so you hopefully will observe some of the things yourselves, and you'll be able to say whether or not you see it in a similar way. So I have studied non-ordinary states of consciousness. The first problem was semantic. You know that in psychiatry, most psychiatrists today use the term altered states, which I cannot stand now after years of consciousness research. And I always have to think about veterinary medicine when I hear it, when you get your dog altered. Because the idea is that we should experience ourselves and the world in a particular way, and that these altered states are kind of a distortion of what it should be. That these are kind of bastardized versions. Whereas I came to the conclusion that they are healing or some kind of interesting, radically different perspective on everyday reality. So we prefer, those of us who've done some consciousness research, prefer the term non-ordinary, revealing, organic psychosis, trivial deliria. They're all non-ordinary altered states, but they are not the kind of category I was towards wholeness. Now what it would mean that we somehow are not whole the way we are. So the basic idea behind this term is that we identify with just with fraction of who we are in the ordinary state of consciousness. I usually use a kind of Hindu shorthand referring to the Upanishads when much larger units becoming other people, experiencing group consciousness, experiencing identification with various animal species, identification with archetypal beings, visits to archetypal domains, and so on. And there's also a very significant experience in which you can have a sense of becoming the divine, becoming the creative principle itself, the experience of Brahman, the Tao, or the Great Spirit, the cosmic Christ, whatever the name is in different spiritual traditions. So this is the term, holotropic, means that these states somehow can take us step by step, sometimes smaller steps, sometimes bigger steps, to the reclaiming of our sort of cosmic identity, of our larger identity. And as you know, wholeness is also related to healing. There is a healing that seems to be happening in this process of melting of the boundaries if the states are properly integrated. So what's the difference between these holotropic states and the other non-ordinary states or the altered states? Understanding celestial, paradisian kind of states. On the other side, there could be hellish state, there could be abysmal despair, there could be tremendous anxiety, there could be profound feelings of guilt, and then anything in between. The intellect is changed in a very interesting way. It's not impaired in holotropic states, unlike in the trivial deliria. The intellect functions in a fundamentally different way. So there are certain situations for which the holotropic changes in intellectual functioning are not great. I wouldn't like to be in a holotropic state when I have to do my taxes, for example. Or it's not good for driving the car. If you are a pilot landing a 747, you want to be in a different kind of state of consciousness. I call that state holotropic. Hyle means matter, trapein again, moving towards. So it's matter-oriented consciousness, which is the everyday consciousness in which we experience ourselves as Newtonian objects, living in a Newtonian world, where space is three-dimensional, time is linear, everything is connected with chains of cause and effect, and so on. Landing a 747, you want to know that you can trust that the runway is solid and that you have certain fixed space-time coordinates. This is not a good time to explore your past life in ancient Egypt. This is not a good time to have an out-of-body experience to San Francisco. You really want to be in the situation. On the other hand, if you spend your life just in the holotropic state, it's very difficult to find any meaning in life. You're a piece of flesh going from conception to death. Whatever you create sooner or later is going to be destroyed. You're going to get old and die. You spend your life like Arnold Schwarzenegger pumping iron, and then at the end there is a senile marasm, or like myself, spending hundreds or thousands of hours in libraries reading books, and then realizing that at the end I won't be able to remember what I had for dinner last night. So there's a sense of futility in that kind of a so-called normal worldview in Western civilization. So you have to transcend that, and that comes in the deeper meaning comes in the holotropic states. So if we want to find deeper meaning in life, if we want to do healing, not body mechanics, we can do very good body mechanics in the holotropic state, but healing always happens in a holotropic state. If you look at the healing ceremonies of shamans or of native cultures and so on, those always involve the healing potential of these holotropic states. If we want to tap deeper sources of inspiration, again, we can do good job in the holotropic state, but some of the major breakthroughs, paradigm-changing breakthroughs, usually come in holotropic states. There's a very interesting book by Willis Harman, the former president of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, called Higher Creativity. We have a tremendous list of situations in which major scientific breakthroughs, religious inspiration, artistic inspiration came through non-ordinary states. You know the Kekule example, which was the beginning of organic chemistry, the idea of the benzene ring. You know the story? Yeah. Mozart said that whole symphonies appeared in his head in a finished form. Puccini said he didn't write Madame Butterfly, it was God who wrote it. He was just holding the pen. It just sort of came through. Ideas for Nobel Prize winning projects, came from these kinds of non-ordinary states, including discoveries in quantum physics and so on. Einstein's discovery of theory of relativity and so on. Also, if we want to cultivate intuition, if we want to cultivate extrasensory perception, that would be happening in the holotropic states. So the intellect functions in a very different way. We can, for example, have the experience of becoming an animal, identifying with an animal, and we can find new information about that animal, which goes way beyond anything that we have learned in this lifetime. So, and completely different way of getting to know the universe, it becomes available in a non-ordinary state. Usually we use our senses, we observe, we analyze, we synthesize. In a non-ordinary state, we learn by becoming something, by becoming animals, by becoming other people, by becoming part of a mythology. Jung, had the concept of the collective unconscious because he saw that in psychiatric patients, mythologies of other cultures can come through, cultures that they have never studied, that they didn't even know existed. So the whole idea of the collective unconscious in its archetypal, mythological way comes from these non-ordinary states. There are also powerful physical manifestations. Again, a big spectrum where on one side there could be a sense of incredible well-being, physical vitality, enormous amount of energy that becomes available. On the other side of the spectrum, we can experience ourselves as dying, or we can experience, extreme pains. We can experience suffocation when we are reliving birth, and so on. So this is the phenomenology of these holotropic states. Now, there are many ways we can induce them. We had, about 5 years ago, we had a conference of the International Transpersonal Association in Manaus, which was called Technologies of the Sacred, Ancient, Aboriginal, and Modern, where we were exploring experientially and intellectually different ways of inducing these holotropic states. So there were shamans from different South American states. There were the Santo Daime people who work with ayahuasca, the Unio de Vegetal people who also work with ayahuasca. There were the Spiritists, there were the Umbanda people. We did a large holotropic breathwork pre-conference workshop, Jungians talking about active imagination and so on. So there are many of these techniques. Some of them developed by shamans, by native cultures, using drumming, rattling, work with sticks, gongs, bells, fasting, extreme physical pain, dancing, drumming, things involving breathing, psychedelic plants, and so on. And they all have been used in different combinations as part of ritual and spiritual life. Obviously, we would not have religions if it were not for these holotropic states. At the beginning, at the cradle of all major religions, were visionary experiences of the prophets, of the saints, of the founders of the religion, and also of the early disciples. So religion began from visionary experiences. Now, when it becomes an organized religion, that's a whole other story. Very frequently, the religion loses the connection to the spiritual source and becomes involved in politics, in secular things, concerned about controlling people, possessions, hierarchies, and so on. So there's a major difference between spirituality, which is a direct experience of these normally invisible dimensions of reality, which is a very private thing. It's between me and the universe and based on personal experience, and then there is religion. Not everything that's religious is spiritual, not everything that's spiritual is religious. So this is related, what I'm discussing is related to spirituality, and that is found primarily in the mystical branches of the religions or in the monastic branches where people actually do practice. They fast, they are sleep deprived, they meditate, they pray, and so on. Religion frequently doesn't involve any non-ordinary experiences. If in today's church somebody would have really a full-blown mystical experience, your average priest probably calls the ambulance and would think that that kind of thing doesn't belong to church. It's okay to talk about what happened to people 2,000 years ago, but those experiences today are not acceptable. There's psychiatrists kind of in cahoots with mainstream religions. They agree on that. So those are the ancient methods, the aboriginal methods, and then of course we have number of methods now contributed by modern psychiatry. Now we have isolated most of the alkaloids from the plants. We have mescaline, we have psilocybin, psilocin, we have the tryptamine derivatives, we have the THC from cannabinol, and so on. We've also experimented with not only sleep deprivation but also dream deprivation, lucid dreaming. We have experimented with sensory isolation, sensory deprivation. Some professionals develop kinesthetic devices like Avram Kaufman's rotating couch. Gene Houston and Bob Masters recreated the witch's cradle that the medieval witches used to get into a trance state, and so on. So there's a large spectrum of these methods of inducing these experiences. Now, there's a tremendous difference between the industrial civilization and all the pre-industrial cultures, the ancient and pre-industrial native cultures. Difference in worldview. Now, obviously, we know much more about the material world than these cultures ever knew. We have, in terms of technology, understanding of material processes, there's no comparison. But that's not surprising. You wouldn't expect that after hundreds of years of accumulation of information. We have books where we can pass information. So in that sense, it's not surprising. But there is another difference which is surprising, and which is in regard to the spiritual dimension. All the ancient and aboriginal cultures, without exception, believe that there are dimensions of reality that are ordinarily invisible. They believe that consciousness, in some sense, is superior to matter, that consciousness does not end with death. There is posthumous journey. There are these different abodes of the blessed and the doomed, and so on. There's reincarnation, metempsychosis, and so on. Whereas for the Western industrial civilization, at least for its sort of main spokesman, this is a material universe. The history of the universe is the history of developing matter. Much of it happened without any participation of consciousness, without any participation of creative intelligence. It happened in a very small, infinitesimal part of the universe after billions of years of development that a life originated. And then within life, then consciousness as the epiphenomenon of the neurophysiological processes in the brain, and then intelligence. So in that kind of worldview, there's absolutely no place for spirit. So to be spiritual from a strictly materialistic psychiatric perspective is to be primitive, to be uneducated, to be gullible, to be into primitive thinking, primary process. Now, if it happens to somebody who's intelligent, like people like in the category of Einstein or Bohr and so on, the idea is you probably have some unfinished business from your childhood. You are carrying some kind of infantile images of your parents, and you're projecting it out there and making sort of gods and goddesses out of them. And when somebody has spiritual experiences, then we give them diagnosis and we put them on tranquilizers. There's a fundamental difference between these two groups of people, all the pre-industrial cultures and the industrial civilization, in relation to spirituality. Now, the usual interpretation is that they didn't have science. We have sort of superior materialistic scientific understanding. The way I would see it after working 45 years with these states is that it has something to do with the relationship with these holotropic states. That all these pre-industrial and ancient cultures held these states in very high esteem. They spend a lot of time and energy developing powerful and effective and safe ways of inducing them, and they were regularly practicing them. So they were having their sort of everyday maintenance activities, and then once in a while they would have a ritual where a group of people or the whole tribe would go into a non-ordinary state, and they would experience these kinds of states, holotropic states that I'm talking about, and they're so powerful, so convincing that once you have them, you have to build them into your worldview. There's no way you can ignore that kind of experience. It would be like talking me out of the fact that there's a microphone here. I mean, I can see it, I have a very real experience. So if people have past life experiences or they have experience of the divine, those are encountering archetypal beings, mythological beings, those are very, very powerful types of experiences. So I see the difference now being based on the naivete of the industrial civilization in relation to these holotropic states. While the native cultures all were using them all through their life, and they combined in their worldview the experience from the holotropic and the holotropic, we have eliminated this holotropic dimension out of our life. We discourage these kinds of experiences. We have even outlawed some of the means and some of the contexts. And when people have spontaneous experiences, we consider it to be pathology across the board, and we suppress them. So we don't have information coming from that domain. Harner, who is how are we doing? Michael Harner, who is a well-known anthropologist, but also somebody who experienced initiation when he was doing field work in the Amazon. It involved ayahuasca and datura, a mixture. He wrote a book called The Way of the Shaman. And in the preface, he wrote something very interesting. He said that from his dual perspective of a Western-trained academician and also somebody who personally experienced the shamanic initiation, that Western psychology and psychiatry is seriously biased in at least two significant ways. The first bias he calls the ethnocentric bias. You see, we have certain kind of perspective on the psyche and what is normal, what isn't normal, and we consider that perspective to be absolutely superior to any human group that has ever existed. We have it really together. All these other cultures are primitive. They are sort of uneducated. What they are doing has no basis. When I had talked with Michael, for example, about the Middle Eastern war in the past, there was a situation, 200,000 people, killed in a way that looked like a sort of computer game. 600 oil wells deliberately ignited, deliberate oil spills into the Persian Gulf. Killing the life for the next 20 years. We all watch it on the television. It's just another day in the Western civilization. If somebody has a past life experience, we think we should put them away and put them on tranquilizers. So this is what Michael calls ethnocentric. Different cultural groups have different concepts of what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. Now, the second bias that he talks about is more interesting from the perspective of my talk. He calls it cognicentric. A probably better term is pragmacentric, which means we have created the theories in psychology and psychiatry on the basis of observations from ordinary states and experiences from non-ordinary states of consciousness. We have systematically excluded somehow from scrutiny, from systematic scrutiny, anything that comes from the study of these experiences that I call holotropic. I'm not talking just about psychedelic literature, where a lot of things were published that were ignored by the mainstream circles. But things coming from field anthropology, things coming from experiential psychotherapy. And from thanatology. I will give you just that example from thanatology. It's well known today that you can be in a state of near death. You have a near death experience, let's say cardiac arrest, and your consciousness leaves the body while you're being resuscitated. Consciousness moves in the room, maintaining the perceptual capacity, can watch the whole procedure from the ceiling, can decide to go and check what's happening in other rooms of the same building, going through walls, can experience something that's happening 200 miles away. And if the person is brought back to life and you talk with them, you get the report, you can then go and check and you'll find out that you get consensual validation that those things were actually happening. The last study was very interesting. Ken Ring studied a group of people congenitally blind who at the time when they had near-death experience, they could see for the first time in their life, and he was particularly interested in what he calls veridical out-of-body experiences, where they not only saw something, but what they saw, again, could be consensually validated. Now, this is a major paradigm challenge. I mean, the modern physicists needed much less to move from Newtonian physics to quantum relativistic physics. So if you work with non-ordinary states, you will see many things like this. I just give it as one example, but we see many of those kinds of things that should not be happening if the way we are describing the relationship between the brain and consciousness is really accurate. Okay, so I will just show you in which areas I believe we would have to change somehow our belief system in order to accommodate these experiences. Am I doing something wrong? It's coming, yeah? Okay. So this is the list that I have in my book of areas of belief that we have, at least the official kind of a party line in psychology and psychiatry, that are seriously challenged by the observations from non-ordinary states. The first one is the cartography of the psyche. We have. Is there any way I can at least see people a little? So we have a cartography of the psyche that's limited to postnatal biography and to the Freudian individual unconscious. If you work with non-ordinary states, people's experiences will not stay within that playground. So when I tried to, after years of research, I tried to map somehow the experiences that were common in psychedelic sessions, I had to vastly expand that cartography and include two domains. The first of them I call perinatal, because many people in non-ordinary states are actually reliving their birth, and they get access to prenatal kind of experiences. Now, it's extraordinary if you think about it that we don't think generally about birth as being a psychotrauma, something that could last 20, 30, 40 hours. The child can be born half dead or dead and has to be resuscitated. This is not considered to be a psychotrauma, but we put tremendous emphasis on the immediately following experience of nursing. Good breast, bad breast, good mother, good nipple, evil nipple, wrong nipple, and so on. So if the child didn't notice that something strange was happening when he or she was being born, it will take a very long time before they can sort of distinguish nuances in nursing. And this kind of work shows you that there is a powerful imprint of the birth process. So the perinatal area has to be added. And then there is a vast realm beyond that, which we now call transpersonal. Some of the experiences I mentioned, we can identify with other people. We can experience group consciousness. We can experience identification with animal forms where new information is coming in. Identification with nature. We can transcend linear time. We can have experiences from the lives of our ancestors. There's a whole important category of karmic experiences, ancestral experiences, the collective unconscious in the historical sense, the way Jung described it. But there's also access there to the archetypal, to the mythological dimension of the collective unconscious. We can experience deities from different cultures, again, whether or not we know this mythology. So the cartography has to be vastly expanded. Now, in terms of the understanding of emotional and psychosomatic disorders, which are not organic, which are what we call functional or psychogenic, again, the general understanding is that you can fully explain them from postnatal events. What happened in infancy, what happened in childhood, and what happened later in life. This whole sort of Freudian idea of the oral, anal, urethral, and so on, phallic, early cannibalism, Electra complex. This should be somehow conceptual equipment that fully accounts for what we see as functional and psychogenic disorders. If you work with non-ordinary states, with people who have these problems, you always get something significant from childhood and infancy that seems to give an explanation, but it is not a full story. Then you find out that the same problem has deeper roots on the perinatal and then typically even into the transpersonal. So let's say you can work with somebody who has psychogenic asthma. In the holotropic breathwork, the person would be, the holotropic breathwork would intensify the choking. There would be choking, and then the first experience that comes connected with the choking would be, let's say, near drowning when the person was 7. Then it continues, goes deeper. It becomes a series of episodes when the older brother was choking that person. Then it goes to whooping cough. Then a deeper layer would be choking in the birth canal. And then you can get a past life experience of being hanged or being strangled. So there is a whole, what I call a coex system, a system of condensed experience. So if we get the biographical part of the story, it seems to make sense, but it would not be the whole story. It would not have the kind of therapeutic impact that we would expect because there is much more underneath. So we would have an expanded view of what is the material underlying a typical emotional or psychosomatic problem. Now, this looks like very bad news. There's much more there than we thought. But the good news is that you also find new, very powerful, effective mechanisms of healing in non-ordinary states. Let's say reliving birth and integrating that experience can be extremely healing and transformative. I have seen powerful healing happening in connection with past life experience. Again, whatever we think about reincarnation, the past life experience as a phenomenon is a very real thing, however we decide to interpret it. I have seen situations where the healing happens when a powerful archetype, Jungian archetype, is allowed to surface into consciousness. Powerful healing can happen when people have experience of cosmic unity, sort of oneness, dissolving of boundaries, and so on. So we find many new effective therapeutic mechanisms. Then we have the strategy of psychotherapy. Now, if you think about it, we have enormous number of schools of psychotherapy, and they have fundamental disagreement as to how the psyche functions, what are the major motivating forces in the psyche, why symptoms develop, what the symptoms mean, and each therapeutic school gives you a different technique that we use to work with the client. So if I'm a beginning psychiatrist, I look at the market, and then one school starts talking to me. Like for me, it was Freud. Wow, this is where it's at. And then if we are there for a while and it doesn't work for us, we get a training in another school, and there could be a fundamental disagreement between those schools. Now this cannot be an important factor, because if the conceptual understanding would be a major factor. Then one school would have to be closest to truth, and that school would have to get most of the therapeutic results. But the studies that were done show that the therapeutic results are almost equally distributed, and each school has good therapists and bad therapists. And it doesn't seem to have a lot of convincing relationship with what the theoretical concept is, what we think we are doing. So some of the studies emphasize that maybe what's important in psychotherapy is the quality of the human encounter between the therapist and the client, or the feeling of the client of being unconditionally accepted by another human being, sometimes for the first time in their life. And the kind of interpretation that we give cannot be the significant part, because that would vary. The interpretation of the same material would vary from school to school. I usually remember something from my own psychoanalysis. I had a psychoanalyst who was a kind of elderly gentleman. He was elderly, he was probably my age now. And he was, as I mentioned, he was really convinced Freudian. And several of us of the same age were in analysis with him, and once in a while he would fall asleep in analysis, and we would have to do something to try to bring him back into the process. And then besides having our own training, we also had seminars where we could ask questions. And so on one occasion, one of us asked a purely theoretical question: what happens when a psychoanalyst falls asleep? If I continue free associating, does therapy still continue? Is this an interruption of the therapeutic process? Should I get refunded for the period of time when the analyst is dozing off? And so he had to answer it. He couldn't say it wouldn't happen because he knew we knew, so he had to come up with an interpretation of some kind. So he said, yeah, that happens. Sometimes you're kind of tired or you're recovering from a flu. So it happens. But when you are in this business for a long time, you develop a kind of sixth sense. You fall asleep only when the stuff that's coming up is irrelevant. He knew a lot about Pavlov, so he gave Pavlov's example of the waking point, when you have the cortical inhibition, the waking point. And Pavlov's example is a mother who can sleep through heavy noises, but when the child starts moaning, she wakes up, it's right there. So it's just like the mother, you just wake up and you're right there. So then I realized there was a problem, because what is relevant, what isn't relevant, depends on the kind of training you have, depend on the school. What's relevant for a Freudian is not necessarily relevant for a Jungian or for somebody who's trained by Karen Horney and so on. So, interesting thing that happens. We discover an alternative, which is working with the healing intelligence of the client himself or herself. In a non-ordinary state, you mobilize this healing intelligence that finds the areas in the psyche that have the strongest emotional charge, that are also available at the time for processing. And in a non-ordinary state, that would become the content of the experience. So it starts spontaneously surfacing, and then in the experience, the symptom is consumed because it's transformed into a stream of experiences. Some of them biographical, some of them perinatal, some of them transpersonal. Okay. Now the other area where we would have to fundamentally change our position is in relation to spirituality. Spirituality is something that's pathological, something that a mature person should not get involved in. Now I'm making a major distinction between religion and spirituality. Spirituality is based on these direct experiences of these, what I believe are ontologically real perspectives of the collective unconscious, of the perinatal unconscious, and so on. So spirituality, as Jung suggested, has something to do with the depths to which we experience ourselves. When our process of self-exploration reaches at least the perinatal level, the experiences would get a quality that Jung called numinosity. They become numinous, which means we have a direct experience of being in a realm that belongs to a higher order. a realm that's radically different from this. And there's a direct experience of this realm being supraordinated to what is happening here, like the realm of the archetypes, for example, and so on. So no matter how the original spiritual experiences were distorted in the history of religion, developing into all kinds of pathologies and so on, religion could not have the role in the history of humanity if it were not related to something that's really basic and relevant in the human psyche. And what I didn't say before when I talked to Michael Harner is that I have worked with hundreds of people who had the best credentials you can imagine, the good IQs and specific training. When they had the chance to have these transpersonal experiences, they would, one after another, would move away from the Cartesian, Newtonian, monistic, materialistic worldview. They would embrace the Eastern spiritual philosophies. Many of them found really some deep truth in the worldview of the native cultures, because they realized, that these are not some kind of primitive superstitions, but they are very reasonable conclusions from some powerful experiences of non-ordinary states. Now, the last thing is that these experiences, when we have them, have usually powerful influence not just on our understanding of psychology and psychiatry, but even the understanding of reality. Particularly what becomes untenable is the monistic materialistic worldview, that matter is primary and consciousness is this sort of insignificant Cinderella that came after billions of years. There's no intelligent order in the universe, it's just sort of bouncing atoms that created it all. And so there's a very, very kind of a universal kind of a spirituality that emerges, that's very similar to what you find in different spiritual systems of what Huxley called perennial philosophy. So in that book, The Cosmic Game, I try to describe the kind of a comprehensive worldview that people develop when they systematically experiment with these non-ordinary states, and show that it is internally consistent. It's a very significant alternative to the monistic materialistic worldview of Western science. On the one hand, it significantly converges with the perennial philosophy, and on the other hand, it significantly converges with new paradigm science. There is really deep connection with quantum relativistic physics, to Prigozhin's work, to Bohm's work, to Pribram's work, and so on. So I think I've ran out of time, about 15 minutes for discussion. Can we get the light out now? Oh, you need this one. You need this one for the television, yeah? That one. It's okay. I can stand it. So again, I realize how radical this is, but I really strongly believe that if you have the opportunity to have the experiences or to work with people who have these experiences, that your conclusions would not be significantly different. So can we open it for discussion, comments? Yes, please.
Is the capacity for this holotropic experience universal, or are some persons more endowed with the capacity than others? Is there a genetics of this ability?
If the holotropic experience is universal, you're asking? You mean if it happens to people from different cultures, from different times?
And even within this population?
It's what will change will be the content of those experiences, but the categories seem to stay the same. For example, the experiences in non-ordinary states would be, one level would be biographical. Then a lot of it through ages would be a death rebirth experience. For example, the shamanic crisis, the beginning of the career of many shamans is a spontaneous visionary state in which they have the experience of going into the underworld, being exposed to different ordeals, experiencing death and dismemberment, and then coming back in a new way, and then flying into the solar realm. The death rebirth experience comes also in rites of passage that are very common in many different native cultures. The initiates, particularly like puberty rites and so on, all are powerful death rebirth experiences. The death rebirth experience comes in the great religion as Dvija, being twice born. In Hinduism, it comes as the being born again. In Christianity, there's this beautiful discussion between Nicodemus and Jesus, when Jesus talks about the importance of being born again, and Nicodemus cannot get it. He says, "Come on, Jesus, how can I be born again? Look at my mother's pelvis. Look at me. I'm a big man. How can I be born again?" And Jesus says, "We're not talking about being born from flesh. We're talking about being born from water and spirit." Also, the experiences of deities. There are many different deities in different cultures at different times, but the fact of the archetypal presence of Great Mother Goddess and sort of demonic presences and so on, you find it throughout ages. We seem to have a new phenomenon now, which is the UFO abduction phenomenon. Before it could have been Chariot of Indra or Ezekiel's vision or something like this. But so the specifics of the visions might change, but the categories seem to remain the same. Yes, please.
I'm very interested in the connections between the holotropic states that you described and quantum relativistic physics that you referred to at the end. For example, Bohm's unfolded universe and unfolded part of the universe, and Penrose's platonic realm where information, fundamental information can be transferred to consciousness along the lines of Kekule's ring, Puccini, and so forth.
Have been very interested in the new paradigm. The book, Beyond the Brain, that I wrote, has the first 90 pages are about the changing paradigm. But I don't think we should take physics as the basis. I was much more interested in the new physics and so on, to the extent to which it undermines the more traditional monistic materialistic worldview, so that it gives us more freedom to see what we want to see. Before, physics was seen, because the universe is only material, physicists were seen as the ultimate authority. Because if you think about it, it's psychiatry and psychology that are the ultimate authorities, because ultimate everything comes through experience.
Well,
Astronomy is not a science about stars. Astronomy is a science about experience. Human experiences of what we call stars.
Matter isn't the most fundamental thing. Matter is a density and curvature of space-time geometry, which is probably the most fundamental thing that gives rise to everything, including mind, I think. But let me make one point, and that is that in the 70s, there was a series of studies on psychedelic drugs by Saul Snyder and Jack Green and some other people, and they showed that the potency of the psychedelic drugs and their hallucinogenic potency was directly related to their ability to donate electron resonance energy to their receptors, which means that they would promote a quantum state in the brain, which suggests that the psychedelic states, the holotropic states you described, may in fact be an increased quantum level of quantum state in the brain, and that consciousness is more or less on the edge between the quantum world and the classical world, and the psychedelic, the holotropic states are actually a more enhanced version of the quantum state. I can show you those references if you want.
I know that you find a lot of evidence in brain physiology and other areas, quantum physics, showing correlations of this kind. But the question is the interpretation. If you think about it, we have absolutely no proof that consciousness is created in the brain, that it originates in the brain. All we know is correlation, systematic correlation between events in consciousness and the brain. But it's the same kind of connection that you find in the TV set. I mean, the quality of the picture and the sound will depend, critically on what's happening in the box. But we cannot say this for this reason. The program must be generated in the box. It leaves the possibility that the program is coming from somewhere else, and still things happening in the box are systematically correlated with it. So I don't know if you can give me one example showing very clearly that consciousness must be generated in the brain, beyond the fact that there's correlation.
Well,
but
I
where is
can't prove that anybody's conscious because consciousness is unobservable, and I can't prove that my patients are anesthetized for the same reason because I can't prove consciousness in the first place. So I can't prove that. On the other hand, if from what you're saying, that consciousness would equally be in this chair or any other object if you take a panpsychist view.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that you can experience the consciousness of the chair. Now, whether the consciousness is out in that chair is a different thing. What you find in non-ordinary state is that everything that you experience as an object in the ordinary state seems to have, in a non-ordinary state, a subjective correlate. I have an experience where, for all practical purposes, I'm a sequoia tree. Here is the sap sort of circulating. Here is the foliage. I'm experiencing the photosynthesis. I experience the change. These are very real experiences. The question is, where are they coming from? I'm describing experiences, I understand, for example, from my experiences, where animistic religion is coming from. Now, I don't think that it necessarily means there is a consciousness in every tree, but it means that the human can experience the consciousness of a tree.
Humans have brains. I mean, animals have brains, and I think animals are conscious. But I think the brain does something to access this fundamental information that's present at a very fundamental level. So I think we're not really disagreeing that much, but I'm thinking what I'm saying is there's a process that has to occur in the brain that might occur in other situations to access and create this experience.
No, I think there's not a big difference, except that we are talking about basic metaphysical assumptions, where you want to put emphasis. Obviously, there's a correlation between matter and consciousness. I would consider consciousness primary because I know that I have consciousness. Whether the matter is there and exactly what it is a very complicated question. If we had a Fritjof Capra here, he would talk you out of this being a microphone and say, well, the deeper you go, the less you're finding, and when you come all the way down, it's just you end up with equations, with probabilities. There's going to be something that resembles more consciousness, mathematics, order, and so on. There will not be any Newtonian stuff left on that level.
I don't want to get into this, and I want to leave time, but I think if you take that route, you retreat into idealism and solipsism, whereas if you say that matter is not fundamental and that space-time geometry, quantum gravity, the things that Bohm and Penrose talk about, are fundamental, and some process at that level leads to consciousness, then I think you can have it both ways, which is what I know.
You see, where I ended up after all these years is I believe that treating the world as if it were material is very important, to be able to do that. But I find difficult to buy it scientifically, or I find difficult to find it spiritually, because it contradicts many experiences that I had. When we talked before, I gave the example of a quantum physicist who was working on an accelerator, coming to the conclusion that matter really doesn't exist. Matter is empty. And then ends the work and goes and crossing the street and a truck is coming. Doesn't say, well, matter is empty, I am empty, so what's the big deal? And cross the street. He says, well, for this particular situation, I will treat the truck and myself as material objects. But all my research is telling me something else, and there's some kind of really strange paradox there, and then sort of there's a need to hold the tension sort of between these kinds of two complementary things in the way you have the wave-particle paradox and so on. Just another version of that. Yes.
Many of us think that the only way the human species will save itself from self-destruction is through some evolution or transformation of consciousness. And that seems even more urgent than ever given the state of the world. What role do you see a new psychiatry or psychology playing in catalyzing that transformation, and are you optimistic about it?
You see, the one that's immediately available, that's legal, would be... there are many people in our experience experiencing what we call spiritual emergencies, powerful states that are currently diagnosed as psychotic, and they are treated as such with suppressive medication. When you support them, when you sort of allow people to go through them, they are very transformative. So changing the approach, the attitude to these states would be one way, psychiatry could participate. The other would be, of course, some acceptable form of non-ordinary states that could be done. Another one would be using the media of communicating some of these ideas, bringing these ideas into education, so that, for example, learning about spirituality and spiritual practice and so on would become part of basic education. But I think we would have to first make the breakthrough, conceptual breakthrough in science. We would have to sort of move away from the idea that any kind of involvement in spirituality is pathological, or at least primitive, uneducated. My personal belief is that psychedelics used responsibly under supervision would be a major tool of transformation. But I don't want to come out as as a propagandist for. I regret really that psychiatry used that tool. I think there was a very exciting sort of road, that was being offered there, and it's just unfortunate what happened. Yes.
Do you think that people whom Scott Peck in his book People of the Lie would term evil could be helped by techniques that involve non-ordinary states of consciousness?
See, there are many, again, you would have to do it in a certain way. There are many instances showing that people who would qualify as evil, if you want, when they had powerful non-ordinary states, experience conversion. Ken Ring describes cases like that. One was a mafia man who had a near-death experience, was completely transformed. There have been attempts, Aronson Hine and other people, using psychedelic therapy with criminal recidivists and so on. So I think the potential is there, because you can certainly discharge a lot of aggression, and when you open up into this transpersonal field, you develop compassion and sort of a sense of connection with other people, with life, reverence for life. I mean, there is a certain, if you do it responsibly, and you offer yourself kind of a loving support, so that you build it into the setting, that it's a powerful tool in really changing people in a predictable way, which is lowering the level of aggression, increasing tolerance, increasing compassion. And also what develops somehow quite spontaneously is tremendous ecological awareness. You don't have to teach people ecology. Then they experience their fundamental oneness with everything. They realize that whatever we are doing to the environment, we are doing to ourselves. There's no way you can extricate yourself from that. So there's tremendous development in people where it was done responsibly toward ecological awareness, towards service, towards kind of global awareness, transcending somehow kind of more chauvinistic kind of attitudes of various kinds, and feeling more of a kind of a global consciousness. Spirituality that comes out is ecumenical, is universal. It's not, we are Christians, you are pagans, you are infidels, you are goyim or whatever. But we're people. We're sort of we are all we are all creations of cosmic energy. We are all in it together. That kind of a message comes through those states.
I have for about 10 years been working with sensory isolation, which is a legal form of what you're talking about, certainly. Mm-hmm. And that research, as I'm sure you're aware, has been done in modern science for 45 or 50 years, and I've been trying in mainstream science to market this technique essentially as a treatment for addiction, and particularly for smoking cessation, which I don't know if you're aware that there have been about 4,000 subjects put through that treatment as a way of stopping smoking. Mm-hmm. And all of that emphasis on behavioral outcomes has totally ignored what you're talking about, the holotropic You know, the side effects, humorously, the side effects of this treatment are always the kind of spiritual transformation that you're talking about. But no one has ever tried to promote this technique in that way, you know, publishing it in very hard science, experimental journals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet the opposition has been profound. I mean, profound.
You would find it in my book. I didn't mention it today, but it certainly is one of those areas where the results have been ignored. They have not sort of been systematically looked at what's happening there. And in my understanding now is, you see, what I believe is important. We all share the idea that good nursing experiences, the symbiotic experiences with mother, are significant for the development of the individual. I would add to it good womb experiences. And the sensory deprivation technique kind of puts you into a state which is like a womb-like. It's like you can offer healing on a very deep level. If we need that experience of merging boundaries and sort of unity and so on. So it's a very, very important technique.
Well, my experience with it in terms of the general public is that so many people are so terrified by this that they won't even come to the door of this room and look in, let alone walk into the room and sit down.
Well, you know, we had one for several years in our garage in Big Sur, and it's pretty claustrophobic. I mean, it's, I don't know what you had. We had the box with the Epsom salts and so on.
Yeah.
Do you have
It's
the...
about 12 feet by, it's a regular room that's 12 feet
Oh, regular.
by 12 feet. That
So that's
we've
a larger
made-
one. Well,
we've
so-
made soundproof and totally dark. But of course, when I invite people to explore it, it's light, you know. I mean, the light doesn't turn off unless they choose to have the light turn on, you know. But nonetheless, people are so frightened by their idea of what this experience is like that
If
they
you can
won't-
project, you project a
Oh,
lot of, from your unconscious, sure. By the way, I have about 17 slides. If any of you want to stay longer, I'll be happy to show that. And I know that some of you have to go, but is there anybody who would be interested in seeing them? Showing what it looks like for one person to go through the death rebirth experience? So if those of you who have to leave, if you have any questions, we can sort of answer that